Brendan and Christine, thank you very much for your presentation and for your work and for engaging in this collaboration. All right, we're going to give our discussants a chance to weigh in and respond, share some perspectives. Doron, can you get us started?
Sure, thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk about what I do, which is more the art of science communication rather than the science of science communication. So I support books, radio, films, theater, television, new media to promote public understanding of science and technology, and I believe they're as powerful a weapon as we have in our arsenal, and we should not forget them. So one notable example recent that you may have heard of is Hidden Figures, which was a book grant that I made 4 years ago, and arguably that has done as much or will do as much to encourage women and underrepresented minorities to go into STEM as my foundation has spent decades and hundreds of millions of dollars on very worthy fellowships and other kinds of programs. So we should never forget that we're all part of a broader culture, and all of us are influenced by cultural products. I'll mention three works that I've supported on the vaccination, one in different stages. One is a play called Mosquitoes, which is a national theater this summer, was sold out. It will hopefully come to New York. It's about two sisters. One of them works on the Large Hadron Collider as a scientist. The other one is an anti-social worker, and she has not had her child vaccinated, her infant. As a result, the child has died. And so the premise of the whole play is whether she is responsible for the death of her child and how she deals with that. That's by a very promising playwright, Lucy Kirkwood, that I hope will reach a broad audience. One way to get that message across. I have two other projects, one on Jonas Salk, of course, and the center of that is when Salk, when there were doubts about the polio vaccine, he had himself vaccinated and, in fact, vaccinated his own children to show people he believed it was safe. And the third project in early development is about D.A. Henderson and the smallpox eradication, which was really to date, is really the most successful single example we have. So I believe by trying to influence the culture in that, what seems like an indirect way, is long-term is really one of the most useful ways we have of influencing them. But onto your specific study, in terms of making one thought that came to mind is, I don't know how much of the details of the study were, what I read about is that you were going to pay a very modest fee for people to participate in filling it out. And my thought was, well, that's a very proven and useful incentive. So what I would do in terms of getting more people vaccinated in Vermont is I would go to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Toys R Us and have them offer a $10 or $20 gift certificate. And when you get vaccinated, you send in your vaccination certificate and they'll underwrite it. Or if it's Vermont cheddar or maple syrup, whatever the local, and I think that's a way to influence behavior, because people, or go to Google and Microsoft and Apple and have them give you, $20 towards your first iPhone, because they start at 3 months, or your first laptop. Have it underwritten in some very direct way, because I think so there are indirect ways like the culture, and then there are more direct methods that I would use. So those would be my suggestions for your very worthy study. And I will say I have, my time is up. Okay, thank you.
All right, Suzanne, as someone who is on the ground practicing communication and squarely in the field of medicine, can you give us your perspective?
Sure. So I will say that Research America, we commission public opinion surveys to try to get a better understanding of where the public stands on medical and health research issues. And so we do monitor and track trends to see if whether or not there's a greater appreciation for science and medical research. And we find that the messenger is key in trustworthiness. And our surveys have consistently shown that Americans overwhelmingly have trust in scientists and medical professionals. And using that information, that could be applied to this study, which I'm sure you're doing, to see whether or not the messenger is really key in the trustworthiness of institutions and the reputation and competence of institutions in terms of getting parents and more individuals on board. We know that the anti-vaccine movement is alive and well, and it continues to be a challenge in terms of trying to determine what sticks, what sort of messaging or messengers really should be on the front lines in terms of changing attitudes and changing minds and perceptions of vaccines and research. And so the one thing I will say that the strength is the partnership between practitioners and scholars. You may want to think about engaging more social and behavioral scientists in the research eventually, and also even think about social marketers in terms of how do you really frame the message for particular audiences. difference. The other thing in terms of building out the study, you may want to think about how can you engage different populations. I know the state of Vermont is mostly homogeneous in terms of the population, but you have to really think about cultural differences. We've seen in surveys where African Americans and Hispanics may have question more of the risks, the side effects of vaccines more so than white population. And so with that in mind, how do you think about designing the study so you're tapping into those cultural differences and really understanding what are the traditions and social norms that impact behavior in those different communities and populations? The other thing to think about, I would say, is how do you engage not only those communities, but those influencers in those communities in terms of who they listen to and who they trust in terms of changing their behavior and really thinking about how this vaccination really affects their quality of life and future generations. And so I will say, as a kid, I used to look forward to going to the doctor to get my vaccinations because there was a trust between my family, my parents, and the medical professional. And so they made it more of an exciting kind of engagement, not so much anything to fear. And so I think if that's instilled in the parents, the children will be on board immediately. And so for me, thinking about those memories, I couldn't understand why, even today, there's still some hesitation with vaccinations. And so that's just my perception of it, but thank you.
Thank you very much. So Paul, you consider yourself a practicing communicator, but you've also embraced an exploration of social science research with your work on climate. So can you give us your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do it. I first want to thank the Academy and the Rita Allen Foundation for doing this competition. It's really very powerful. And I thought when I was invited to talk that since I'm not an expert in social science or in vaccines, maybe there was some mistake. And there may still have been, but in any event, I do want to talk a little bit about the fact that as Climate Central really does communicate the science and impacts of climate change to the broad public and also to decision makers, and for the purpose of inspiring an action to be taken about climate change, the question that Climate Central has an interest in answering is how practitioners and academics can learn from each other and really work forward to make the knowledge base be something that can be used effectively. So I'm delighted that this is a study of both that utilizes both practitioners and from the Academy. As one of the instigators also of the Communicating Science Effectively report, I'm interested particularly in common factors that are across different disciplines where the science itself, it may be solid, but there's social contention. And what common factors you might uncover. So I would encourage you to be thinking about not only how this works in terms of vaccination, but what lessons we might be able to take forward to apply, for example, to the extraordinarily entrenched views that are in the climate conversation, and what methodologies we might be able to draw from that. I'd say there was an interesting dialogue between Bob Hornick yesterday and another faculty member from University of Pennsylvania about the importance of granularity in understanding the response to vaccinations. And the presentation that Bob made was at a national level data that showed that there really wasn't a decline in vaccinations, but in local places there may well be. And so this is an interesting opportunity to look at something that's more localized. And I'd just say finally that I think that it would be really helpful if you might be able to talk about the theoretical underpinning of your creation of this way of doing empirical study, because that theory can, we hope, also be translated, social science theory can also be translated and applied in other spheres, such as in climate change communication. So congratulations, it's a great project, and look forward to the outcomes.
Thank you, Paul. So Greg, you've got some, you've got a unique perspective here in that you fund projects involved in science communication. So what do you have in the way of reaction and even guidance for this team?
Yeah, thank you. And also thank you to, did I turn this on? Yeah. Thank you also to the National Academies and to the Rita Allen for inviting me to be on this judging, this review committee. I have to say there were a lot of projects. I don't know how many were in total. They just gave us some of the short list, but even that short list was maybe 30, 40 projects. And it was a real pleasure to read through all of them. I think all of them had components that were worthy of looking at. And congratulations to you and the other finalists from yesterday. So I think two things struck me in your lit review. One, building upon what Suzanne said, this idea of the trusting the source and trusting the messenger. I know that you guys are somewhat limited by the statistical power of how much, you don't know how big the sample size will be, but I would certainly encourage you to consider that within the treatment conditions, this idea of trusting the source. And I haven't seen the final details of the experimental design, and I appreciate that it's still being kind of finished and polished, but you mentioned kind of the emotional resonance or the storytelling, and I think we specifically are really interested in the power of storytelling and reframing and getting buy-in from people that might be skeptical. So I would also encourage you, if the sample allows, to consider a treatment scenario that might incorporate storytelling to see what that might teach us. And then, just to take a step back, I would like to add that from a funder's perspective, I think this is really exciting. I mean, specifically for Science Sandbox, which is a new initiative at the Simons Foundation. For those that don't know, a strategic portfolio of grant making specifically focused on public engagement with science. And our target audience is the niche of folks that are not currently identified as science enthusiasts. So there's a lot we don't know and understand about what resonates with these communities. And I think partnerships like this really might allow us to push us past, if we're to get past these kind of imperfect measures of impact, we've heard clicks, butts and seats, these sorts of somewhat meaningless measures when you're talking about attitudinal change and change in the zeitgeist, which is really what we're trying to unravel here. I think if any approach has potential in starting to unpack these really complicated and social scenarios, I think getting social scientists and behavioral scientists out of the lab, partnering with content creators, with producers, with people from the media, I think that'll go a long way to potentially creating the types of outcome measures and evaluations that we as funders are really hungry for. So I applaud you guys' effort in taking the first step, and good luck. And there.
All right, thank you both. And we have got time for questions. And as per our previous sessions, we're going to take some from the audience and some from this handy iPad over here, which questions will come from Twitter and from the telecast. So why don't we start with our in-person audience? All right, we've got a question up at the top there.
Hi, I'm Erica Shugar from the American Society for Cell Biology. And I was wondering, you made a comment about that it was really hard for you as a researcher to make a connection to practitioners. And I've had a few successes as a practitioner working with researchers, but it's been hard for my side as well. And I'd love for you to reflect on why you never did that before, because it's like there's a lot of vaccine practitioner people out there. So just why was it so hard?
That's a great question. I didn't know who to ask in some cases. I didn't know how the appropriate point of contact. Despite publishing in this area, I've had very limited contact with the CDC, and I haven't gotten very far with them. I guess I would say that maybe I didn't look hard enough, but I think that's often the common thing. It's hard for all of us to say no, right? It's the awkward asking people to the dance moment where you say, could you? And you could also imagine people who aren't a good match for you in terms of your approach or the ways you like to study the question. I should mention, though, that, and I neglected to mention this during my presentation, that there's a new website that's run by some political scientists I know called Research for Impact, the number 4. and they're actually trying to facilitate this kind of matchmaking process. So if you're either a practitioner or a scholar who might like to pursue this, that's a great place to start. And of course, as with any dating service, the more people in the pool, the better the matches are. So I would encourage you all to check it out, and hopefully we can make these kinds of matches easier.
Thank you. All right, let's take one more from the audience. All right, here in the front.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question in terms of rhetorical style in trying to engage in science communication. And do we sometimes, in trying to be successful in a particular communication, risk winning the battle and losing the war? And the thing that came to my mind, that brought this to my mind, was the statement about using anecdotes and the power of the anecdote. And while there may be power in the anecdote, I don't dispute that, to convince people or persuade people about something you want to persuade them about today. By doing so, do we not then, in that example, reify the use of anecdotes, which is directly in opposition to what, for example, science is all about, and Atul Gawande talked to us about last night and said, it's not about the anecdote of somebody whose kid got autism after a vaccine. We want to get people away from thinking about that. And so when we rely on the anecdotes and the power of the personality and all of these kinds of characteristics, yes, we may win that moment, but do we in fact continue to reinforce non-scientific thinking?
I can trust that. I think it's important to have a balance of it, and I can think back to a day when I was testifying with our legislature and came in with all our good data that demonstrated the need for what legislation they were looking at, and finished with all the importance of vaccines, and in came those that were opposed to vaccination rules and all. And within minutes, they talked about one child that had one reaction to it and the challenges, and the committee was completely, oftentimes policymakers, they were completely taken by that. And it actually led to some changes, and what they did is they changed our medical exemption no longer to say not only those that are contradicted, but also might be detrimental. And what CDC is promoting based on research is a mixture of that. And I don't think we want to make up anecdotes or have some, but I do think that having been a nurse practitioner and talking with people, and if I mention I have vaccinated my children, or I did lose a cousin to polio as I did, sometimes it helps them to understand where you're coming from. But I think there is a risk that we want to still stay with the data.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go to the webcast. We've got George on the webcast feed. George would like to know, how can communicating science make an impact on political agendas, such as cannabis legislation, and be used effectively and clearly in a developing market where there's a lot of folk medicine and clickbait that competes with the empirical evidence? So what's your experience with those kind of factors, and how are you thinking of a connection to the policy discussion?
That's a hard one. I'm not sure I have a great answer. I guess I would say, I'm an empiricist, so I guess the question is, we have to start by measuring things, and the best way we know to assess the effectiveness of the messages we use is randomized controlled trials. So in my field of political science, we've started to do more of those. We started especially with voter turnout studies, but we've moved on to lots of other kinds of strategies. And you might think about what we could randomize, what step in the process could we randomize to try to learn something as rigorously as possible about how to change political agendas. So now political scientists have gone on to do things like, so for instance, or other social scientists, there was a study recently of intimate partner violence and in a developing world country, where they actually randomized showing a movie dramatizing that problem and rigorously measured the effectiveness of that movie. So going back to the importance of culture, the effect of that movie on people's willingness to report intimate partner violence, right? So there's all sorts of things that we can randomize across, the political and social sciences and in health and medicine that can provide new insights. That's not the only way to learn things, of course. Experiments are one tool in the toolbox, but they're a really powerful one, and one I think we don't take advantage of enough. And I would just say to many people in this room, the practitioners have the leverage to make those kinds of strategies possible, right? If you're going to be rolling something out anyway, why not randomize it, right? You can't deliver it to everyone all at once. So instead of haphazardly rolling it out, let's randomize how we roll it out, and let's partner with someone to evaluate it and see if it works. So that's the kind of approach that I would recommend for these kinds of questions.
Thank you. So I'd like to sort of raise the issue of, or the question of, uncertainty versus risk, right? So even in our gold standard trials, there is uncertainty. And so this is not my area of expertise, but my sense is there's a lot of heterogeneity in how we understand the effectiveness of these various vaccines, in the uncertainty around that. Yet in some cases, we're propelled to action, balancing the risk equation. So how much is that, striking that balance, kind of entered into your thinking here? Or maybe I'm off.
I want to defer to my colleague on that one.
So I think one of the arguments when we had 2 different legislative sessions to eliminate the philosophic exemption was exactly that. People saying, no, there isn't a risk, and other people saying, there is a risk, and it came with how you looked at the data. Because if it's one of those ones that Atul Gawande talked about, if there's fear or whatever stands higher or threat than promise. And so if people have been vaccinated and we aren't seeing the disease, it seems like it's not there. I think that the uncertainty is a huge issue right now. And I think that it's uncertainty because people are concerned about the safety of vaccines, they're concerned about whether they're necessary, and I think they're not getting the answers that they need, and they're not always feeling that they're well respected when they raise their questions. And I do think the research going forward has to begin to address some of the most common questions from those that have doubts or those that are uncertain, instead of always looking at how do we tell them that their risk is greater than they know.
And that's a problem across all science. So nothing's 100% certain. Every time you go in for a major surgery, you have anesthesia, there's a risk of dying from it. And so it's a question of how people are making them more comfortable with the level of uncertainty, which is a broader problem, I think, that we have to address.
Thank you. All right, let's go back to our audience. Another question there in the middle.
In developing your project in Vermont, what is the most counterintuitive insight or observation that you've seen so far?
You're the Vermont content expert here, so.
Counterintuitive.
People might be surprised. Well, let me take a stab at this. One insight that we're trying to leverage in our study, and I can't go into too much detail, but I hope this gives you a flavor. One thing that people might not realize is even in Vermont, which is a state that has a reputation as being kind of a hippie state, one that might embrace natural health approaches and so forth, those vaccination rates are still very, very high, right? People overwhelmingly vaccinate their children, right? I think the thing that might be counterintuitive is with all the noise around the anti-vaccine movement, the fact is that parents in Vermont, just like almost every other state in this country, overwhelmingly vaccinate their children. And one of the things that we have to balance in thinking about how we communicate about this issue is addressing the risk of the threats that do exist to herd immunity, while at the same time not scaring parents, not causing there to be perceived to be this widespread disapproval of vaccines. There is not. Right? And one of the things I think we can do that might be more effective is actually to remind people that the social consensus in Vermont, as elsewhere in this country, is overwhelmingly in favor of vaccines.
We've got time for another question. Here in the front.
Perfect.
I'm glad the gentleman raised the issue of the sort of two-sided or double-edged aspect of vignettes or scenarios. I mean, the problem is that the availability heuristic makes these things very compelling. And I understand that standard practice in journalism is you start with the specific and then maybe you get around to generalizing, whereas in science writing you start with the general and maybe sometime you get around to some specific examples. This is a really broad problem. It's not just in the vaccine area. I mean, it's true across all of the science communication issues, and we haven't been talking about it enough. I mean, it cuts both ways. I mean, as you indicated, you can also produce scenarios which persuade people that the science is all wrong or that I should ignore it. So I'm not posing a question so much as saying that I think we should be talking in this forum about the double-edged nature of scenarios. It's particularly true, for example, in the climate space. I mean, I've actually published on some of the risks, and when you look at the literature on scenarios, I've actually found people who say, oh, scenarios are wonderful because it's a way to persuade somebody of that you know, the particular policy you're advancing ought to be adopted.
So, I didn't sense a question, but did someone?
If I could respond.
It's an issue we should be talking about more in this setting.
Yeah. All right, great. Did
I'd like
anyone
to
want
make
react?
a comment, if
Yes.
I could. So I agree with you that scenarios can be very risky, and in the process of sketching those out, possibly lead people to a place where you don't necessarily want to be. And for that reason, sometimes we think about alternative strategies, such as, for example, the one that Brendan and Chris have developed of getting the high credibility of healthcare providers to speak to the validity of what is being presented. So a third party, the messenger, is a critically important element of this, and it's a workaround of hitting it directly, but sometimes workarounds are very effective.
All right, and we are against our time, so we're going to have to stop there. Hopefully, we're all a bit more informed now about communicating around vaccines, and maybe you've got some new ideas for cross-disciplinary research collaboration. So thanks once again to our panelists and our discussants.